Hi, and welcome back again to Extending and Expanding Notions of Family in the Interpersonal and Family Communication Classroom. I'm Jimmie Manning, Professor and Chair of Communication Studies at the University of Nevada, Reno. And it is early morning in Reno right now. So when I'm recording this, it's still pretty early. I got my first cup of coffee, and so you'll excuse me if I sip it a couple of times or more throughout the session. And then I guess I should also warn you that my dog is being an absolute punk this morning, so I worry that he will interrupt. But yeah, actually, while I'm kind of spilling, all the personal stuff, the other thing I'll say is, as as I like get into this session where I think it has some of the more interesting or unique readings related to family communication, it just makes me really sad that this is the way that the series has to go this year. And so, if it weren't for COVID-19, we would be sitting at a table talking about these readings maybe, and you would be giving me your insights rather than me just talking at the camera. And I would be hearing about the activities you do in your classes, and it would be a lot more dialogic. And so I guess I'll just say I'm a little bummed that we can't be together. Um, but then I'm also, kind of happy that I get to share some of my favorite readings about family communication with you all. And so um, today's readings and activities and assignments are about space, place, and metaphor. And so I have two goals for this session. First, we'll look at four readings, and these are readings that I think can help students and family communication researchers and just people who are interested in family communication to think about family communication in different ways. Related to maybe, the space or place is the first part of that looks at, examines, but also methodologically as we get into one of the articles, and then in terms of metaphors. And so what is it that different ways of thinking about what family communication is contribute to how we can understand family communication as family communication scholars. All right, and then the second goal, I'm going to give you an activity that relates to space and place, and then an assignment for a paper about metaphor. And so that's what we'll do in this session. Let's jump right into goal number one in those readings, because we're going to talk about one of my favorite books ever produced in the communication discipline, and that's Robin Boylorn's book, Sweetwater, Black Women and Narratives of Resilience. And so for this book, because I couldn't give you the whole book, I gave you one chapter from the book. And I apologize for the reproduction of that chapter because I know it didn't copy the best. But hey, let that be a sign and do yourself a favor and go buy a copy of this book, because I promise you it is worth the read. You're going to enjoy it, you're going to learn from it, and you're going to love it. Sweetwater is a story, a very highly personal story, because it's Robin Boylorn's own story. And so this is autoethnography. But she's looking at growing up Black and female in the rural South. And then in addition to her own story, she's sharing the stories of other Black women in a familial village community in North Carolina. And this all relates back to when she was growing up and then going back and revisiting Sweetwater. And so it's highly personal. I'm trying to be a little bit vague because I don't want you I don't want to spoil the book for you. But let me just tell you about four features of the book that make it great for a classroom. And so I'll tell you, I don't use this in my family communication class, although I could use it in my family communication class. I actually use this book in my advanced interpersonal communication class, which is usually juniors and seniors. And the way that class is set up is it's treated like a weekly reading group where we come together, we read a series of books, we all sit in a circle and discuss them and dialogue and talk about them. And then we'll often write papers, usually about two per book, short papers that kind of tie into it. And that's kind of how that class works. And so Sweetwater is great for that, although I imagine there's lots of different ways to teach it. And so one feature of this book that makes it special is that it poignantly and vividly sets up a space and how it relates to family in a highly personal way. And so when you read how Boylorn sets up Sweetwater, you're going to feel like you're there. You can kind of taste it, smell it, understand it. And yet in providing those details, it's often very personal, and you get a sense of what Robin has experienced in the past and how she's experienced it. and how that plays into the theorizing and thinking that she does in the book. Second, Sweetwater allows students to see the connections between personal stories and the theories, concepts, and topics they are learning. And so as we bring in topics or theories from other books, those apply to Sweetwater. But let me tell you, even if you didn't have anything else in the class, students are going to learn a lot from this book, because she does a lot of careful thinking and theorizing related to the stories that she's telling. So it's not dependent upon other things, but I really like that students can bring it in. On that note, though, I will tell you there are some students who do not warm up to this book immediately. Like, a lot of students come around and tend to enjoy it by the end. But I tend to hear, especially from a lot of white, probably middle class students, that they can't relate to the book, or they just don't understand that, or it doesn't appeal to them because they can't see themselves in it. And I think there's a lot of learning that happens there. And so I get pretty explicit sometimes with, hey, not everything has to be about you and your experience, or me and my experience. But there's something to be said for just sitting back and appreciating or understanding or learning about another culture, even when there's nothing in it for you or something you can't reflect on, right? And so that's okay. We can think about other cultures, and it doesn't have to always be about us. So I think that's a good lesson that students can also learn. Third, it provides insights to art as inquiry. And so I would say this is a kind of creative nonfiction that Boylan is putting forward as she shares her stories, as she shares the stories of others. But then also you'll notice that with your sample chapter at the end of it, there's a poem, and that's how all the chapters are set up. And it's really cool because the poem is kind of a different way at looking at some of the things that were in the chapter, yet at the same time it expands the chapter too, right? So it's kind of a both and as it relates with the chapter. And it lets students see that, you don't always have to have a research study or a textbook to learn about something and think about something in a different way. Sometimes art can be that inquiry and that thing that kind of gets you thinking forward about a topic or a concept or an idea. And then finally, I think the book does a lot of encouraging for its readers to think about who gets to tell stories and how they get to tell stories. And Robin is really explicit at the beginning of the book about, there's something here that I am a Black woman able to tell my story and help other Black women tell their stories, when for so long, Black women weren't allowed to tell their own stories. Someone else was always telling their stories for them. And so I think that that's something that resonates throughout the text, and kind of, how does voice come into play, and why is the ability to tell stories so important? So there's a lot there. It's a great book, highly recommended, even if you're not going to teach it, or you don't have a class where it would fit. Get a copy, read it, you won't regret it. All right, moving into another piece of family communication research. This time looking at a piece of research that kind of pushes both how we think about family communication and how that happens, but also thinking about how we might push methodology. But this article is from Joan McAllister, and it's called Figural Materialism, Renovating Marriage Through the American Family Home. It was published in the Southern Communication Journal. And this article has three features that I think make it an interesting read. Probably not for undergraduate classes, but definitely I've included it in my graduate family communication seminars, and it has blown students' minds. And so one thing that blows students' minds is the article offers an overview of how sexuality became a part of the marital institution. And so a lot of students are surprised to learn about some of this history of sexuality and how sexuality was seen as a threat to marriage. And rather than try to ward the threat off, it was actually integrated into marriage. And so the eroticism of marriage was an intentional thing, right? And so a lot of people are like, that wasn't just always a thing, that people were in love and got married and had sex and only had sex with each other. So it kind of plays with those ideas of what a marriage can be and how that relates to family. But then it also sets up this idea of figural materialism. And I'll tell you a little more about what that is in a second. So that is a key concept, though, and feature of the article. But as part of that setting up of the idea of figural materialism, it gets at this idea that there's a materiality to the American family home. and that this kind of setup or layout of the American family home kind of restricts or constricts people to certain kind of lives and certain kind of interactions. And so I guess what I'm saying there is a connection between how the home is laid out, how the home exists, the discourses of the home, and how that relates to family communication. And so she doesn't say that explicitly, but looking to page 279 of her article, she says that the study illustrates how figurations of the couple run through the literary, visual, and spatial discourses in ways that colonize eroticism in the service of traditional social institutions, reinscribing gendered and class subjectivities and constraining sexual agency. And so as you can see there's a lot to think about. And because this is rhetorical criticism, it comes at it in a different way. And so an argument I would just make here is that we need to be looking more at how other areas of the larger field of communication studies are dealing with family communication. And I think this is one great article that you can use to do that. And I can tell you that graduate students really love unpacking this, discussing this, talking about this. Although I will say that you want to make sure you're familiar with this, because they do tend to, now my cat is on me. They do tend to, I want to make a Carol Baskin joke so bad right now. Hello, you cool cats and kittens. Okay, sorry, puppy. Anyway, moving on. Next, for your reading pleasure, I've included 2 chapters on metaphor. And so in part, this is a shameless plug for a book that I am editing with Jordan Allen and Kathy Danker called Family Communication as ... Metaphors for Thinking About Family Communication. And so particularly, a simile is a kind of metaphor. And so what we're doing is we're setting up authors with a simile that they will write about. And so we were just gobsmacked by the excellence of some of these first chapters as they came in. One of those being Devika Chawla's Family Communication as Object. And she's particularly looking at this idea of the materiality that is there in family communication and how memory can play with that materiality. And so that chapter, beautifully written, very accessible. And so I think students can relate to it well. And then we also have Bernadette Calafell and Nivea Castanada's article, chapter, Family Communication as Performance, where they're examining how families perform this notion of who they are and how that's a form of family communication. And so again, I'm trying not to go into too much detail here because I don't want to spoil these chapters, and that's quite true with both of these. Because there were moments that just kind of caught me off guard. And so I want you to feel that. And so I don't want to give that away. But I will tell you that there are 3 benefits of these chapters to a family communication classroom. And so these are not classroom tested yet, because this is from a book that has not come out yet, but should be out within the next year. But one of the things that the chapters in this book can do, and particularly these 2 chapters, is encourage students to think through different lenses or metaphors about what family communication can be, right? And so we don't have to think about family communication in one way. We can think about family communication in multiple ways. And this will tie into an assignment that I present in just a moment. It also offers a highly personal understanding of what family can be. And so how people see family, kind of getting back to what I said about Boy Learn, kind of just experiencing how other people think about family and do family and be in a family. And so these chapters offer some well-written and vividly articulated insights there. And then I would also say that these chapters in particular help to combat the whiteness that often dominates family communication studies. And so one of the things that we just have to do better on is a lot of family communication research is about white, middle-class, educated families, and particularly in the United States. And so we've got to expand that. And so these chapters do that in a modest way, but there needs to be a lot more. All right, so moving into the activity and assignment for this session. The activity that I'm going to tell you about is the Imagining Family Futures activity. where I ask students to think of their ideal family space. And so this is an invitation for students to maybe even get a little radical. And so if we were thinking of the perfect, ideal, wonderful, beautiful family space that we'll have in the future, so we're done with college, we've got our family together, what's that going to look like? So that's kind of the concept that I throw out for this assignment. So to do that, I first encourage students to think both about what they've learned about family communication to this point in the course, as well as what they have just considered regarding place, space, and objects. So obviously, this is coming after a family communication lecture I've given for my undergrads about place, space, and objects, and how those have relevance and meaning in family communication studies. I then offer the students the idea that part of what accompanies learning is not just examining facts and empirical evidence, but imagining possibilities, right? And so we should be able to take the things we're learning from doing research studies and say, okay, what is a possibility from that? But even removed from the research studies, we know our own experiences with family, whether it's hurt, whether it's joy, whatever it is. And so that can play into these possibilities as well. And so students are then presented with drawing materials, including markers, crayons, colored pencils, ink pens, a variety of papers, just whatever you can pull together and say, okay, we're going to do some art here. So I'm going to lay it all out. Come and get what you need. But your job here is that you have to use these materials to engage and create a beautiful family future. And so you got to use your imagination here to draw what that looks like to you. Probably it's going to be a space. It can be who you want in that space, but what is the future family that would just be perfect or ideal for you, right? And so you're really removing any limitations that the students have about what they can do with this assignment. And you're asking them to tap into that creativity and to think about, what can make for that perfect family experience. And so after they've had some time to do that project, you reconvene the students, and then I just have to tell you that, oh, okay, I messed up here. Students will often ask, do you mean a house? Or, so you mean after we've had all our kids, or similar questions. And so when you do that, be evasive as possible, encouraging them to feel the freedom to make their space as what they see as ideal. Because you don't want to, ruin the imagination that some students will have. But I'll be honest with you, some students have a really hard time imagining some kind of perfect family future. And then students are often, then students are pulled back together to share their creations. And if possible, that might mean that they're all on display. And so sometimes if the classroom's big enough and if it has few enough students, I'll have them put them on the walls. And so we kind of make it an art gallery of family futures that we can look at. Or sometimes I'll collect them at the end of the class and then I'll get to the classroom early and I'll put those up. But then ideally, some of the students will have the time to explain what they created and why they saw that as their family future and so on and so forth. And then we have a discussion. And so the first discussion question I often ask is, looking across all of these, what seems to be similar across the family spaces? And then I ask, do any of these family spaces stand out as different to you? Because what you're sadly going to see, so here's the sad part of the assignment, the art sounds fun. A lot of people will just draw a living room and say, oh, well, this is my wife and my kids, because they have a hard time imagining family looking different. But there will typically be some students that have created spaces that are different and wonderful and fantastical. And so the second question offers you an opportunity to kind of look at those spaces and think about those spaces. Third, you can ask them, was this a hard activity and why? And so some of them say, no, I did fine, but that's where you might push a little and say, but this looks a lot like a typical family house. Do you think families are perfect the way they are? And that can be a genuine question too, right? So they don't have to think that families are all messed up or all, family experiences are bad. But it kind of opens up the dialogue, right? And you're kind of getting at, we have a hard time imagining family in different ways because family is so ingrained as an institution that it's hard for us to see out of the institution that we have. And so to that point, you can ask them, what kinds of messages do we receive that guide us toward making these spaces? And so what are these larger cultural messages about who a family is and how it functions that make it difficult to do this activity, or for some people that kind of make us feel liberated, or like we can just go in and create this new ideal family space. So a fun activity, students seem to love it, especially when they see the markers and that kind of thing. But it also gets some really good ideas out there, and it really is a concrete way of helping students to see that even when we say, hey, you can make family be anything you want, it's there. And so you can ask what I think is a very fair question: is that because we're satisfied with how families are? And so some students say yes, and they say, I grew up in a great family, and so the ideal family space is what I grew up in. And other students will say, no, my family was hurtful, and so I want a different kind of space. Or even if they had a good experience, I just imagine family this way. So very interesting assignment, gets students to be creative, but also looks at some of the realities of how we think about family and the limitations we have for thinking about family. All right, moving into the other assignment. This is a paper assignment, and it's called the Family Communication as Writing a Metaphor paper. And so students are asked to develop their own family communication as essay. And so what this is actually, I've not done this particular assignment. I've done a variation of this assignment. And so when I teach communication theory, I teach a book called Communication As, which was the inspiration for Family Communication As. And then I have students read the different metaphors that are presented chapter by chapter. And then afterwards, I have them write their own communication as essay. And so the riff here is I would have them write their own family communication as essay. And so the essay should use support from class readings as well as extant sources to argue for a particular metaphor, or to present, I don't know if we have to use the word argue, but to present a particular metaphor related to family communication. This metaphor is limited to 5 pages, not including references. So you want it to be somewhat concise, yet at the same time, they have to bring in class readings and other research or resources that would be appropriate for their paper. And then one thing I would suggest is you might consider allowing students to do a redo of a metaphor that they were not satisfied with from the original text. And so in the Communication As book, there are particular chapters that they might be like, this is a great idea for a metaphor. I don't know if they reached it. You might let them go and rewrite that chapter, so to speak, so that they can do that metaphor properly, right? Or do it right in their minds, right? And kind of compare it. Or they might even find that as they're doing that, like, yeah, it was actually a pretty good metaphor. And now that I've researched it a little more, I can kind of see better where they're coming from. And so there's some learning there too. And then similar to the original text, there are no limitations on genre or style. And so as I say here, limitations on genre or style should be minimal. So in that family communication, in that Communication As book, just as with the Family Communication As book, some people have written their chapters as creative nonfiction. Some have written them as dialogues or plays. Others have written them as literature reviews, right? So there's different ways that you can do this. And so this is another spot where you can allow students to be creative. And as I've talked about in the other sessions, oftentimes I like to unpack papers as they're turned in and talk a little bit about them. And so one question I ask is, does anyone want to share their metaphor? Which, you see that. But also, in particular with this assignment, this makes for a good parent share where you get 2 people to sit together and talk about their metaphors. Or one time I even set it up kind of like speed dating, where I had students switch off. And so one group of students stayed put on the outside and a group of students moved around to kind of allow the students to have multiple metaphors that they were able to talk about one-on-one and share with each other. And then another question I have is, how could an individual family member's metaphor for family help to guide their interaction with other family members? And so by that, I mean, I try to get students in the idea of, so if you saw family this way, or if you believe that this is a kind of a way you think about family communication, how might that actually get into how you're actually communicating with your family or even about your family? So that's where that question goes. That one, I'll just warn you, is a slow burn. So I don't do it with family members. I do it with communication with others in general. And so a lot of times they'll be slow to kind of discuss that at first, but then students will really start to get into it. And start to think about different ways that metaphor could influence how they communicate. And then sometimes students will even realize that, maybe this wasn't a good metaphor to pick and defend after all, because I don't know how practical it is or how realistic it is. You can also ask the question, how might your individual family history help to influence the metaphor you chose? So that's a great place where the students can make it personal and about them, and to think about, what is it about me that led me to thinking about family communication in this way or through this lens? And then also, who do you believe might be interested in or benefit from your metaphor? So I call this the for whom question, right? So is this just a metaphor for you? Or who else might benefit from reading this? Or who else might be like, aha, after they've looked at it? And so what might the audience for their particular paper be? And then I often shut the discussion down. I actually ask as a final discussion question. So we just wrote blank metaphors as a class. So if there's 24 students in the class, we just wrote 24 metaphors as a class. Do you think there are any metaphors for family communication that we shouldn't allow or that should be prohibited? And so it's kind of engaging in opposite think, right? So rather than saying, here are some good metaphors for it, are there any that we should reject or prohibit or say these shouldn't be metaphors? All right, so just out of respect to the original book that got me to thinking about metaphors, Communication as Perspectives on Theories is the name of that book. You can see the details of it there. And then recently, Adam Tima and Autumn Edwards created kind of a new version of this book called Communication is Perspectives on Theory. So both of those are kind of riffs on the same thing. And that's where the family communication as idea came from. All right, so that does it for number 4. Sorry that today's seminar was a little rougher. Part of that's just because dealing with different kinds of readings and different kinds of thinking. Part of that is because it is early morning and I didn't get to drink much of my coffee. But next time we're going to be thinking more about some deep ideas and new ways of thinking in family communication. As in session 5, we look at the critical interpersonal and family communication studies movement. And so critical interpersonal communication studies have been around for decades in some form. But recently, there's been a real movement and a real gathering of scholars around this idea that there are critical interpersonal and family communication studies. And so we're going to look at that, especially as it relates to family communication in session number 5. So you have some more options to think about what are the different ways or avenues we can get students to think about family. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please send them to me. I'd love to hear your feedback. I'd love to hear if I got something wrong. I'd love to hear other ideas you have. You can reach me at jimmie@unr.edu. That's JIMMIE at unr.edu. And then don't forget, you can get those readings, you can get those assignments, and you can get other videos where you found this video on the NCA website. So www.natcom.org. And thank you to the National Communication Association, as well as you for being a part of this. And so I'll see you for session 5. Have a good day.